Anna and Agata, thank you for being with us. We've been trying to arrange this for a while, so it's great to have you here. Dr. Anna Szwed is an assistant professor at the Institute of Sociology, Jagiellonian University in Krakow. Her research interests focus on gender and religion, lived religion, and public religion. She has published articles on women in Catholicism, women's online religious communities, and Roman Catholic Church's discourse on gender. She is the author of the book, The Second, The Image of Women in the Teaching of the Roman Catholic Church and the Awareness of Priests, published in 2015, and is the principal investigator in the project Resistance and Subordination, Religious Agency of Roman Catholic Women in Poland, which is funded by the National Science Center in Poland. Her colleague that is here with us is Agata Rejowska, and she's a teaching assistant at the Institute of Religious Studies and a doctoral candidate in the Institute of Sociology, they're both at the Jagiellonian University in Krakow. In 2021, she was a visiting assistant in research at Yale University's Center for Cultural Sociology, and since 2019, she has been a member of the research group for the project Resistance and Subordination, Religious Agency of Roman Catholic Women in Poland, which is funded by the Polish National Science Center. In 2022, she received the Ministry of Science and Higher Education Scholarship for Outstanding Young Scholars. And since 2022, she is a General Secretary for the International Study of Religion and Eastern and Central Europe Association. She has authored several peer-reviewed publications, including in the journal Sociology of Religion and Social Compass. Thank you again for both of you for being here, and I will turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you very much for this kind invitation, and we're really happy and honored to speak for the Irish Institute for Catholic Studies. And as you could hear, we have a sociological background, so we will be speaking about religion and about Catholic women from sociological perspective. Okay, I will share my presentation. Okay, I think it's there. So in our presentation, we will refer to the results of the project that you mentioned, Resistance and Subordination, Religious Agency of Roman Catholic Women in Poland, which was founded by National Science Center. I would like to say a few words about this project because it is embedded in this specific context of recent changes in religiosity among Poles. So over the last 30 years, the religiosity of Polish society had remained relatively stable. However, in the recent years, we have witnessed noticeable shifts in religiosity of Poles, especially among young people, educated people, and those living in big cities. So the idea of our project was to go against the grain and do not ask why women lead the church, but to investigate those who stay. So highly educated women living in big cities in Poland who stay religious, who are Catholics, and feel somehow connected to the church, and moreover, they are engaged in religious groups or communities. So in our project, we were interested in the reconstruction of lived religious practices in women's everyday lives, but also in explaining how through these practices women comply, reinterpret, or resist the existing religious and gender rules. So we acknowledge that doing religion is doing gender at the same time. So I would say that basically we were interested in women's agency, and also in the question of how religion may contribute to women's agency within work and family. A little bit about methodology. Within our project, we conducted 48 in-depth interviews with educated Roman Catholic women living in big cities. I mean, cities over 250,000 inhabitants in Poland. So it's quite important to stress that they were mainly middle-class women. All of them were members of various religious groups or communities, which may, of course, serve as an indicator of greater religious involvement. All these communities were formally recognized by the church, and among them there were charismatic groups, formation and evangelization communities, women-only groups, but also mixed groups. Our interlocutors were between 23 and 44 years old. Two-thirds of them were married, 3 were in the informal relationship, and 1 was divorced with formal annulling of the marriage in the church's court. Half of women had children, 16 of them had 3 or more kids, and most of them worked professionally. Only 5 stayed at home, and 8 were on maternity leave at the time of our research, but on a daily basis they were working. In our project, we also conducted ethnographic research in 3 Catholic communities for women, but we will refer to this part of the research only in part. So just to say, to give you the general view of our presentation today, I would say that the aim of our presentation is to show how, under the ongoing postmodern transformations of intimacy, religiously committed Roman Catholic women reproduce the rule of indissolubility of marriage, which is prescribed by the church. So we are interested in the grassroots practices through which women sustain the durability of their unions. So we argued that the repetition and sharing of certain practices lead to their institutionalization in the form of informal rules, which are supporting the church's fundamental rule of indissolubility. So based on empirical material from our study, we would like to take a closer look at 2 such informal rules. The first one we call the rule of religious homogeneity, and the second one we call the rule of embedding marriage in Catholic networks. But before we move to this empirical part of our presentation, I would like to say a few words about the context of our analysis. And the context is, of course, transformations of intimacy which are taking place in contemporary societies, and which are reflected in such factors as growing numbers of divorces, growing numbers of cohabitation, exmarital births, but also deciding against having children, as well as the falling popularity of religious rites of passage, such as, of course, Catholic marriage. So these changes, of course, as you probably perfectly know, are also subject to Roman Catholic Church concerns expressed both at the universal level, but also at the local level. When you think about this, the Synod on the Family or Francis' exhortation Amoris Laetitia, you can easily find the links between what I'm describing as a context and a church's teachings. I would say that these changes in intimacy, these transformations of intimacy, also apply to Poland. When we look at the data, we can see that between 2000 and 2017, the number of religious weddings in Poland decreased by 10%. And meanwhile, the divorce statistics are increasing. At present, I think it's 1 in 3 marriages in Poland that ends in divorce. So the acceptance of divorces is also rising. And something that I mentioned, that I've already mentioned, is this local context, so these changes go in line with broader changes of religiosity in Polish society, which have been observed for the last few years. So, although in the terms of declaration of religious belonging, Poland is still, I think, one of the most religious countries in Europe. But at the same time, in many respects, religiosity of Poles is undergoing privatization. When we look at the content of people's beliefs, or when we look at the morality, that's very visible. The newest quantitative research indicates, for example, that religiosity rates are declining, with especially young, educated and big city people becoming less and less religious and more critical towards the institution of the church. So within this context, our respondents who are religious, church affiliated, educated, married or assuming marriage in the future, and at the same time, they function in metropolitan, secularized environments. We think that they represent a very interesting case study for analysis. And I'm passing the voice to Agata.
Thank you. And I will make a brief introduction to our theoretical framework. So, as we already noted, the formal rule of marital indissolubility is the constitutive principle on which Catholic marriage is based. However, for the existence of the institution of marriage, as for any social institutions, the mere existence of an abstract rule is not sufficient. Inspired by the theory of new institutionalism, we claim that for an institution to last, it must be sustained by social practices. And we understand such practices as repetitive human actions that can be discursive and non-discursive, reflective and non-reflective, and which have an agentic potential for institutions. And importantly, practices also create and reproduce informal rules, which together with formalized ones serve to support the social institution. Informal rules give hints what is right and normative in a given situation, how to interact with other people, and what obligations social roles and positions bring. At the same time, they express social expectations, which makes the social world more predictable, and therefore it limits the need of constant negotiations. And rules are therefore certain dispositions, and social practices becomes carriers of these rules. As guides, however, rules are not deterministic because social actors must interpret them for them to work. They should be seen not as external to human practices, but as recursively linked to them. It is important to note, however, that rules are often normalized and commonsensical and practiced as a routine and habit. And at the reflexive level, as shown by new institutionalists, they are revealed particularly at the moment of when they are broke. And institutional rules depend on the context, and this dependence may take the form of isomorphism. Isomorphism means that institutions and social organizations start to resemble their surroundings, including other social institutions with which they coexist. And in our research, we depart from analysis of formal institutions and organizations, following the trail of studies that focuses on human activities within a religious institution, understood as a conglomerate of rules. And inspired by new institutionalism, we define Catholic marriage as a social institution that is constituted by formal rules, including the rule of indissolubility, and by various informal rules that are maintained by social practices. Therefore, the overarching aim of our presentation is to reconstruct the informal rules that sustain the durability of Catholic marriage and which emerge from the practices women undertake in their everyday lives. As a result, we can point to the informal rules of attaining religious homogeneity and embedment of marriage in Catholic networks. And we wish to emphasize that the areas of practices and emerging rules identified by us do not provide an exhaustive answer to the question of how Catholic marriage is maintained. We particularly concentrate on the couple itself in the aspects most closely related to the durability of marriage, rather than, for example, on their relations with their children. And now I will move to the empirical material we gathered and to the analytical part of this presentation, and I will discuss the first rule, the rule of religious homogeneity. Anya, can you move the? Oh, thank you. Yeah. So the research participants, they.
You've muted yourself by accident, I think.
Yes, I thank you. So yes, so I want to discuss the first rule, the rule of religious homogeneity, and it's perceived by our research participants as an important factor contributing to the lasting of the relationship. However, whereas aspiring to homogeneity need not always be an entirely conscious process. In the case of of the woman participating in our study, it was reflexive and often even methodical, based on a clear plan of action. So here I distinguished two different actions undertaken within the field of religious homogeneity. One of them concerns the search for a partner, and the second balancing religiosity levels in an already established relationship. So now I will focus on the first aspect, so looking for a godly husband, as I called it in the paper. So for our interviewees, religion was a key factor that they considered in their choice of a partner. And the women often looked for men who not only declared Catholicism, but who was also similarly religiously engaged, referring to this figure as a converted Catholic. This expression is additionally significant considering the specificities of the Polish context, because although, as Anya already said, although around 90% of Poles declare belonging to the Catholic Church, but although this fact, their religiosity is internally differentiated and represents more various streams, liberal, more conservative, or some folk streams. So it's internally differentiated. And among our interviewees, most popular actions for finding a suitable partner was prayer. Maria, who is single, declared she prays to attain religious homogeneity in a future relationship, and you can see a fragment of the interview with her. I hope so. You can see this. So it might seem that the ideal of marital homogeneity would be a high level of religiosity presented by both spouses. Our interviewees' practices, however, indicate that aspiring to religious homogeneity in fact means achieving similar patterns of religious attendance and similar level of theological conservatism rather than religious excellence. And Carolina, who is now married, told us that she was at first not interested in getting to know her current husband, as she was dissuaded by the fact that he was a student of theology, which she equated with overly committed religiosity. And since it was important for the research participants for their partners' religiosity to be on a similar level to their own, they often saw it as a self-evident that the search for a partner should begin in the immediate surroundings, meaning their own religious community. Some of the women approach this process methodically, with religious homogeneity as one of the criteria organizing the search. Alina said that she had divided the characteristics of her future husband in terms of importance, with the most important one being love for Jesus. And Alina's actions are an illustration of Weberian value rationality, since her target action, the search for a husband, was subordinated to concrete values, love for Jesus. Such rationalization of intimate relationships would not be possible without the development of psychotherapy and feminism, among other factors. Both therapeutic discourse and feminism demanded that women should be their own objects of scrutiny, analyze their values and objectives, and then they choose the means for achieving them appropriately. So putting together a list of demanded attributes in a partner is a rationalized practice that assumes that a woman has a choice, demanding introspection and subsequently verbalization of her needs and their calculation in the spirit of the recommendations of therapeutic discourse and the demands of feminism. And the cases we analyzed show that conservative religious circles, in an adaptive way and in an adaptive response to the environment, also make use of the resources of the secular and more liberal world, tailoring them to their own needs. And the rationalization of the mate selection process is an effect of homogenization and subordination to the dominant cultural values such as efficiency and calculability. And the second aspect of the rule of religious homogeneity is balancing religiosity levels. So another example of subordination to the process of rationalization was constant monitoring of the levels of the women's own and their husband's religiosity. It demands continual evaluation of one's own feelings and emotions. And in this sense, we observe not only a process of fusing of religion and everyday life, but also the process of externalization and objectivization of religiosity, which in specific context becomes a separate part of internal life and an object subject to constant evaluation. And based on our interviewee statements, we can conclude that to attain religious homogeneity within the relationship, a woman should monitor her religiosity so that it is not uncomfortable for her husband, regardless of whether her religiosity is higher or lower. And checking one's own religiosity in this way to ensure it remains within the norm means that the individual needs of religious development become secondary. And as Dominika, a local leader of a women's religious group, puts it, my life can be a constant prayer, but only one that won't put my husband off me. And the same interviewee notes that women tend to lose themselves in religiosity at the cost of marital relations. As she points out, however, lay women should sometimes rein in their religious fervor, as they aren't nuns, as she said. In this situation, the burden of emotional work rests on women to ensure they remain within the norm. And as we mentioned above, one might expect the highest possible level of religious engagement to be something desirable among the representatives of Catholic religious groups. However, the narrative suggests there is a rule that their religiosity should be above all balanced with that of their husbands, which is supportive of the institution of marriage. Although the research participants perceived women's religiosity as something naturally at the highest level and more emotional and affective, they also thought that women should control their religiosity in order to accomplish mundane objectives. While in other cases, according to the traditionalist Catholic narrative, women ought not to suppress their innate essential characteristics, in the case of religiosity, our respondents recommend restraining emotionality as a way to ensure the sustainability of a marriage. And borrowing from the psychological discourse, which advises how to manage feelings and control emotional life, the psychological discourse, the narrative similarly suggests managing religious life and surrendering to certain healthy standards. The practice of tempering female religiosity was supportive for both the institution of marriage and patriarchal culture, as exuberant women's religiosity could be a threat to the man's authority in the marriage. So now I will pass the voice to Ania.
Okay. Okay, so the second rule that we would like to discuss today, which emerged from our empirical data, is the rule, we called it the rule of embedding marriage in Catholic networks. And definitely the durability of marriage is also maintained via these practices that embed the union in Catholic networks. When I say Catholic networks, I mean the systems of individuals, groups, or organizations invoking Catholicism's values and rules system. So in our interviewee's case, a key role was played here by religious groups and communities in which they, and often also their husbands, were members. And this quotation from interview with Jovita is, I think, expressing this very well. Jovita said, "I'm not saying that everything is rosy and that all marriages in Christian communities are great, but I have the sense that it is much harder for them to decide on steps like divorces." So belonging, as Agata said, belonging to the same religious group can be a result of the search for a partner within the community, but it might also be caused by an already existing married couple who jointly search for a community of this type. And it's quite interesting that the process of engaging in community often proves to be demanding, as it demands compromises, demands reconciling the couple's different expectations. So it's a kind of paradox that actions which are intended in the long run to strengthen the relationship can, in the short term, also cause transitional crisis between the couple. Finally, however, the women we researched saw this shared belonging to religious groups as a benefit since it allowed both the husband and the wife to develop spiritually. It encouraged them to spend time together and freed them from the need to negotiate the space and time for individual religious activity. So this informal rule of embedding marriage in Catholic networks supports the durability of the union, at least in three ways. The first one would be that such networks legitimize axiological choices in accordance with the teaching of the Church. For example, concerning the indissolubility of the union. Secondly, these communities have a socializing effect on spouses. And thirdly, the specific forms and tools of work on the relationship are disseminated in the communities. And as regards, I will shortly discuss these three aspects. As regards the first one, as I said, the Catholics that we studied were educated, usually professionally active women who were functioning in secularized big city context. So being embedded in Catholic networks meant that they obtain an access to environments in which values important to them, such as those concerning, for example, marriage or reproduction, are legitimized by the community. So these communities, these groups serve to preserve the Catholic institutional order, and in this aspect they are can be seen largely as spaces of resistance to the secular influence of environments in which women function. Although, as I will discuss in a moment, they are not entirely immune to this influence. So embedding marriage in a system of group references, I would say, increases the responsibility of both spouses to maintain a durable relationship. So in addition to vows made to the spouse and God, it also becomes a kind of promise to the community. And I think that this power of stabilizing role of the community is well shown by the case of Liliana, one of our interviewees, whose marriage ended in civil divorce and finally in annulment in the church. Her husband's violent behavior led her to leaving home and deciding to end the relationship. And since part of the community to which she belonged refused to accept this fact, she was increasingly marginalized in the group and ultimately left it. So, as I said, finally, the marriage was annulled in the church court, but this experience of group ostracism and questioning of her status as a Catholic remained a very vivid memory to her. And this case of Liliana, of course, it demonstrates that Catholic networks are an important element of social control and have the capacities, of course, to apply sanctions, for example, in the form of ostracism, that secure these institutional rules concerning marriage. The second role played by such communities is socialization into marital roles and normalization of crises. So this is, of course, particularly important or particularly refers to groups which are aimed at married couples or entire families. The members of such groups learn what it means to be a wife and a husband, although the models of marital relations promoted in these groups vary. One of our interviewees, Adriana, for example, mentioned that she took from the community the belief that the husband is the head of the family, so quite patriarchal vision, I would say, while another, Helena, emphasized that the group's role in communicating the model of a man who's engaged in family life and childhood. The second point is about normalizing crises. That was very, I would say, very interesting when we were analyzing data to see that communities' socializing influence on couples is not limited to communicating abstract models, like idealized models of marriage, but also involves normalizing crises as parts of married lives. So in these groups, the marriage is not presented as a space of a problem-free coexistence, but rather as a continuous work on the relationship, which resembles very much the secular idea of working on a relationship. This idea, I think, is well expressed by Adriana, who says, "I got married very young. The world tends to say they lived happily ever after, but even then I was aware that it wasn't just the beginning. Before we get there, it's a very long road, and so we don't lose that what is important and build it on certain values and also have support and just models." And I mean, you can pay for therapists, you can read wise books and so on, but that will never replace relationships with other married couples who will tell you, we were there too. You can get through it. So that's the supportive aspect of belonging to religious groups. Our analysis also shows that Catholic communities play an important role in solving the problems that actually occur in marriage. And many groups were able to develop specific tools aiming to facilitate communication in couples and reduce tensions. And I think that the ritual of marital dates is a good example here. It's a kind of idea of meetings of a husband and wife for joint prayer and conversation. And women believe that the couple is accompanied by the Holy Spirit, which creates suitable conditions for discussion. And we can interpret, I think, this kind of ritual as working as safety valves based on anticipation of potential conflicts in couple. Our interviewees' comments on how communities for Catholic couples operate also call to mind therapy groups in which couples work through their problems in the relationship. And of course, some types of events such as workshops, marital weekends, or recollections are using this psychological inspirations in a very open way, but at the same time combining it with religious interpretations. So I would say that these groups offer a kind of hybrid solutions to marital problems. And this process of emerging of such hybrids resembles the mimetic isomorphism that Agata was talking about in this theoretical part. And for some of the research participants, it is exactly these hybrid forms inspired by, for example, couples therapy, but also not excluding the religious aspect that seem especially important and especially working. So they permit work on the relationship in a safe space without undermining the principle of the indissolubility of a marriage. And now we will move to conclusions, and Agata will say a little bit. Agata, we can't hear you once again. You're muted.
I'm sorry, I keep forgetting about this. So our analysis demonstrates that for deeply believing women who belong to conservative religions, doing marriage and doing religion are closely intertwined. And while some actions undertaken by women are routinized, others are strategic and based on a selection of appropriate means to achieve the objective of survival of the marriage. These methods may be religious in nature when Catholic women, in order to sustain the durability of marriage, employ religious forms of activity and legitimization, but they can also use broadly secular means, and in this sense, work on the relationship in Catholic marriage resembles processes that also take place in non-religious unions. And the practices we analyze often produce hybrid solutions combining religion and elements borrowed from the secular environment. Although conservative religions are often perceived as rejecting a secularized liberal world, our analysis proves that processes of mimetic isomorphism also occur in these conservative settings. According to new institutionalists, mimetic isomorphism is a response to uncertainty, and in our case, it is the liberal postmodern world that is a source of such uncertainty. Relationships are less solid and durable, and new forms of being together are emerging, as Anya said in the introduction. And to adapt to the changing environment, religious institutions use some of its resources, mimicking certain secular patterns or narratives. For instance, the interviewed women borrowed narratives from psychological and feminist discourse, focusing on verbalization of needs, introspection, and choice, and applied them in the process of looking for a godly husband. And in the same vein, practices from couples therapy and self-development programs were adopted and used in religious groups and communities. And the practices aimed at sustaining the durability of marriage are therefore heterogeneous, although this doesn't undermine their consistency in the respondents' perceptions. While the formal Catholic rule of the indissolubility of marriage is of a general and abstract nature, the informal rules are very concrete, relating to different spheres of life, for example, food, sex, conflict resolution, being in a group, and so on, which at first glance has no sacred meaning. Our research indicates that if formal religious rules are to be practiced, they often need informal support, otherwise they risk remaining a dead doctrine. The repetition of practices and the sharing of informal rules in the various Catholic environments in which our respondents function indicates the solidification and institutionalization of these rules. And at the same time, they are often the subject of reflection for the women we studied, the result of a search for solutions in both routine and crisis situations. And in this sense, the role of Catholic women can also be interpreted as institutional designers who take a creative and agentic approach to ensuring the durability of marriage. Informal rules, which often function as normative guidelines of a non-deterministic nature, are thus a space of women's agency in relation to marriage. Nevertheless, the role of informal rules towards the institution of Catholic marriage should rather be seen as reproducing its structures. The formal rule of indissolubility imposed by the Church is rigid and taken for granted, and any change can only take place within the limits set by it. I'm sorry, my dog's excited for something. And this confirms that the principle that when structural constraints are strong and formalized, rules are inflexible. Conscious and agentic action cannot always transform the institutional rules organizing social structures. Change, when it does take place, tends to be the result of long-lasting and often difficult to predict circumstances. So thank you very much for your attention, and we're looking forward for discussion.